Hello, and thank you for joining me. Pie. It's American.
Would you like some pie?
And like a lot of dishes in American cuisine, the origin can be traced back to somewhere across the Atlantic, but over the years, pies have most certainly become distinctly our own. Everyone knows the big hitters, apple, pumpkin, cherry, but today I'm focusing on one that is perhaps a little less well known. We're talking rhubarb pie. We owe our pie influence largely to the English, and rhubarb pie is particularly English. Rhubarb pie in the States would go on to become popular in New England and especially in the Midwest. I've known a handful of memorable food personalities from the Midwest, my grandma being one of them, and the other one that comes to mind is Chef Kristen, or Chef Kristen, as I usually addressed her. She was a sous chef back when I worked at Jean Georges. She actually gave me a hard time a while ago when I made a recipe from JG and mentioned Chef Joey and Steve, but not her. So I told her I would dedicate a video to her in the future and even asked her what I should cook in such a video. She gave me a number of options, all of them baked goods, one of which was pie. So here we are at long last. Rhubarb pie, dedicated to Chef Kristen. She is a great baker and great explainer of all things food, so I hope I do this pie justice as I bake it and explain it. To start out, all pie needs a crust, so that is where our journey begins. We will be making a pâte brisée dough, also known as a short crust dough. This recipe can be used for both sweet and savory applications, so it's a good one to keep around, and you can memorize it easily with a ratio, which is 3-2-1. That is 3 parts flour, 2 parts fat, and 1 part liquid. For the flour, all-purpose will do just fine, and for a double crust, we will need 340 grams of flour. Also, we just want a little pinch of salt and a nice tablespoon of sugar, and I give that a whisk. If you were doing a savory pie, you would just omit the sugar. And for the fat, the variety is up to you. For today, I'm doing all butter, but feel free to play around with lard, Crisco, or some combination. And for the math, if our 3 parts is 340 grams, that makes 2 parts of fat, 226 grams, más o menos. I just cut that butter into cubes, and now the goal is to incorporate the butter into the flour mix, and we want that butter to be very, very cold. For a flaky pie dough, you want the butter to be evenly distributed. Keeping the butter cold allows you to break it up into small pieces without it melting, and as the pie bakes, the water in the butter releases steam, which creates the puffy, flaky network in the crust. As you can see, I'm using a funny tool to incorporate that butter into the flour. It's actually called a pastry blender. It's a little old-fashioned, but when I make pie, I like to slow down and go a little old school. That being said, the modern method of using a food processor is a bit quicker and produces good results. Now down to the 1 part, our liquid. And this is most always ice, water. Remember, we want to keep everything cold. Based on our other weights, we are looking for around 115 grams of water. But because there can be so much variability and humidity in flour, don't add it all at once or you might end up with an overly wet dough. And to the same point, don't be afraid to add a little more water if the dough is feeling very dry. I just add a bit of the water, stir it up, and see if it comes together, eventually dumping it out of the bowl to get a better idea of where I'm at. I didn't actually end up using the entire 115 grams of water. We don't need a completely uniform ball, but we don't want big fissures and cracks that will give us trouble when we go to roll out the dough. Once I get that into a relatively cohesive mass, I go ahead and divide it into 2 almost even pieces, going slightly bigger on one. The slightly bigger piece will be the bottom crust and the smaller one will be the top crust. Once I divide the dough, I try to form them into rough disc shapes. This will make rolling out the dough slightly easier after it rests. Speaking of which, at this point we go ahead and wrap each in a bit of plastic wrap and set them in the refrigerator for 30 minutes. This lets the dough relax and allows the flour to hydrate a little more, which makes it easier to work with. Once we have rested the dough, we get that onto our work surface and begin the task of rolling it out. I take a glance at my pie plate to start so I know approximately what I'm aiming for, then I go for it. Giving myself a little dusting of flour, I begin rocking the rolling pin back and forth and occasionally giving the dough a quarter turn. Sometimes I'll even give the dough a flip just to check out what's going on the other side. Once I think we're at the size we need, I lay the pie plate over to check it out, and like usual when I make pies, it still needs just a little more. Err on the side of caution and give yourself a little bit of slack to work with. With the slight extension achieved, I roll the dough up onto the pin and then try to lay it down over the pie plate as evenly as possible, which I almost achieve. But I think I can work with this. I just press at the dough a little bit to make sure it is hugging the walls of the plate with no air gaps. Then I use a small knife to trim off the excess dough. And yes, we do have a little gap, but we can use some of our trim here to patch that up nicely. One benefit of a double crust pie is that such imperfections will be completely hidden, though feel free to give me a hard time about it. Now I just throw a towel over our pie crust and set it in the fridge while we put our filling together quickly. It's rhubarb pie, so we need some rhubarb, and here I have a couple nice bunches. We need around 4 cups in total, and this will be more than enough. I just go ahead and trim the top and bottommost parts off from the stalk. We certainly don't want any leaves in there. After that, I just give the stalks a rinse in some fresh cold water. Then I just set to slicing them. Let's call those half-inch-ish slices. Now for our sugar and thickening agent, we've got a cup of regular sugar and a generous quarter cup of flour, about 30 grams or so. We just simply whisk those two ingredients together. Now we pull our pie plate with the bottom crust back out and sprinkle the bottom part of that crust with a bit of the flour-sugar mix that will protect the bottom crust from the juices in the early stages of the bake. Now I just toss the rest of the rhubarb with the flour-sugar mix and set it inside of the pie. Looks like we have the perfect amount. Now as a last little boost of flavor, I just zest a lemon over the top of the filling. The citrus aroma works really well with rhubarb. Now I just need to quickly roll out the top crust so we can get this in the oven. Same as before, I just roll and turn the dough. Once it seems like I'm there, I check the pie plate to make sure I'm in the ballpark. And once we have it just right, I roll the dough onto the rolling pin and then lay it over the top of the pie. And that is decent coverage. And then I just go around the edge of the crust once more and press with my thumb to try and encourage the idea of cohesion. Then I use my knife to trim off the excess once more. We don't need to worry about those hangnail pieces, we can clean those up easily. And now I go around the edge of the crust and try to pinch the two crusts together to form a sort of lip. Once we have a sort of lip formed, I travel around the perimeter and using my pointer finger on the one hand, I push the crust into the sort of triangle shape between my thumb and pointer finger on the other hand. This creates a sort of crimpled effect. I know at this point you might be nervous. I know the crusts aren't sealed and my crimping is imperfect, but I've seen into the future, and it's all going to be just fine. And now, as one final step, I just brush the top of the pie with a bit of egg wash, and then make a few classic slits or vents in the top. Rolling pie dough is always a bit stressful, so I always enjoy the point where the pie finally goes into the oven. At that point, the die is cast. We have that oven at 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 220 degrees Celsius, and we slide our pie in and let the fates decide how things will play out. After 15 minutes, I drop the temperature to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 180 Celsius, and let it ride out for another 40 minutes or so. My pie was also taking color quickly, so I covered it with a piece of foil to protect it for the rest of the journey. But eventually it was time to look at what we had wrought. And there it is! I would say after the handful of little crust imperfections and crimping insecurities, things turned out pretty great. And those pie vents look so great with that rhubarb bubbling underneath. But of course, one tragedy of pie is that you must let it rest or else you will have a mess on your hands. So find that perfect windowsill and let it sit there enticingly until it is fully cooled. Patience is a virtue, and I've certainly practiced that today. But it's finally time. I get my landing zone in place, and then I go in for a slice. They say the first slice of pie is never perfect. But I don't know, the sound of that crust is pretty perfect. And do we stick the landing? Oh, yeah. With just a little slight crust wound suffered. And looking back at the almost whole pie, we can see how that flour has really created the perfect consistency. Tight enough so that the slice holds, but still just loose enough so that it has that juicy look to it. And now it's time to enjoy. But wait, there's more. I was on a bit of a rhubarb kick when I filmed this, so I also had made some rhubarb swirl ice cream. So I think we should just do ourselves a favor and get a nice scoop of that on our plate. Oof! And if you don't have the ice cream, this pie also pairs very nicely with a fine cup of coffee. Either way, you'll be saying things like,
"This must be where pies go when they die."
Damn, that pie's good.
2 more pieces of this incredible pie.
Thank you for joining me today. And thanks to Chef Kristen for being a really cool chef. I hope I did you proud here, despite the flaws. I love making pie, but it also stresses me out a bit. So I was a bit self-conscious to film the process. If you enjoyed this video, drop me a like down below and subscribe for more pleasant videos, meandering as the narration can be from time to time. And make sure to hit me with any questions you might have about this recipe or just say hello. Maybe suggest another pie I might try. Most anything is possible in my kitchen. Until next time, cheers!